Okay, so the customer approved the replacement of this tensioner. I have my brand new timing belt tensioner here. I'm gonna get this opened up, get her installed here real quick. One thing you'll notice is it has this pin in here that holds it together until you're actually ready to pull it out. Sorry about that, we had an alarm going off. Okay, so I got my bolts, got my brand new tensioner. I'm gonna get this tensioner set in here, get my bolt started by hand real quick. Okay, got my bolts started with my fingers there. Now I'm just gonna tighten these bolts up. Grab my little ratchet here. Set this down for a second. Grab my 10mm socket. Get it on my ratchet. Get down in here and snug these two bolts up on this tensioner. Very hard to do with one hand, but I'll make do. Okay, got them snug down. Now I'm gonna grab my 1/4" drive ratchet and just make sure these are snugged up enough. That one's good. Just give it a little bit of a tweak there. Like I said before, these are only like 8 or 9 foot-pounds, so they're not very tight. They will break and then you'll have an extreme problem. Okay, so I got the tensioner back in, and now what I'm gonna do is reinstall my tensioner pulley. Make sure your sleeve's in there, like I said earlier. Get your bolt, make sure that's all together. It goes over this little protrusion on the water pump here. I'm gonna get that in there, get my bolt started with my hand, get it snugged down with my fingers, and then I'm gonna grab my ratchet, my 14mm socket, and tighten it down. Okay, got my 14 here. I know it's kind of hard to see, I apologize. Get this thing tightened down. Like I said, use a torque wrench. Don't be an idiot like me. Get that nice and tight. And then before you get ready to put your belt back on, make sure this moves freely, doesn't bind up. Make sure your pulley spins nice and smooth. Feels fine. So now I'm gonna grab my brand new timing belt. Okay, I got my new belt here. All right, I'm gonna start putting this belt on here. So what you're gonna do is feed the belt down there, and we start off with the crankshaft pulley. This is probably gonna be difficult for me to show you, but I'm gonna get it on the crank pulley down there first. And it has little slots and little teeth, so I'm just gonna stick it on there. Make sure I got it set on that crank pulley down there, just like that. And then I'm gonna bring it around, going towards the front. I'm gonna grab the belt, get it on the back side of that idler pulley there. I'm sorry about, you can't really see it. And then I'm gonna work it around to this front camshaft. Make sure I kind of pull it pretty tight there. It's really hard to do with one hand here, so I'm gonna have to set my phone down. And I'll get it around that front camshaft pulley here. Make sure I got it nice and tight. Work it around. Make sure all the teeth are in all the slots. And I'm gonna go down underneath my water pump and to the back camshaft pulley, or sprocket, or whatever you want to call it. Work it around, and this is pretty difficult. I've done this so many times that I can do it fairly easily, but it likes to give you problems sometimes, and sometimes you have to rotate the camshaft ever so slightly to get the new belt on, because the old one will be stretched just a little bit, so it's not going to be exactly the same as your new one. So it looks like I'm going to have to grab a wrench here. It's very hard to see here. I'm going to have to turn that camshaft ever so slightly, so let me grab my 17mm wrench here. Really wish I could get a good view of this. Okay, so there's your rear camshaft there. And this bolt in the middle is a 17mm. Trying to get my light propped up here so I can actually see. Oops. Okay, so I got my belt stretched up here, and I need to move it up just ever so slightly, I believe. Let me get a good look at this thing. It's hard to see from where I'm standing here. Okay. So what I'm going to do is turn it this way a little bit. And now essentially the mark isn't going to be exactly perfect, but when I go to tighten everything back up, I'll move it back, and that'll make my timing mark go exactly where it needs to go. So get this on here, finish up by getting it around this tensioner pulley here. Being very difficult for some reason, so I might have to move my front cam just a little bit here. A little bit, not very much. Pull this back off again, just a little, turn it a hair, and I'll get my belt on here like that. Okay, so now the belt's on all the pulleys, and then when I turn this back to where it's supposed to go, it'll add tension onto that. It's kind of hard to see this rear one here. I'm gonna turn that rear one back, and then check and make sure that everything's tight. Look at my little mark here where that white dot is. It goes across to that line there. That one's perfect. Then I'll check my rear one, which is very hard to see. You can see that line is lined up with that mark there. And then I'm going to get down here and double check my crankshaft. See how that is off ever so slightly, but that's okay because when you turn this thing, it's going to tension up a little bit. I can grab my 19 and turn it just a little tiny bit. See if I can see it here. See, there we go. Just ever so slightly. Now that's perfect. Everything's lined up. Double check my marks one more time. That one's looking good. That one's looking good. So now all that's left is to pull out this pin out of the tensioner to put tension on this, because see here, the belt's pretty loose. Once I pull this pin out, it'll tension up that belt. So what I'm going to do is grab some wire cutters. This is my secret for getting these pins out, because if you try to pull it out by hand, it'll never come out. So I'll just grab it with my pliers, kind of wedge it up against that pulley there, and just kind of walk it out a little bit at a time. And then boom, there it is. Pull the pin out, double check everything, nice and tight, nice and tight. Everything's good and tight. So now I'm going to start putting everything back together. I'm going to start with this bracket. Put this bracket back down in here. Very hard to see because I got to do this with one hand, but okay. Get that bracket slid back on there. Start tightening, getting these bolts started by hand. And what I'm going to do is grab my 14mm socket again. I'm going to use my electric ratchet to get these snugged down. These top 2 bolts snugged down until they're bottomed out. Okay, and then I'm going to take my 3/8 ratchet and get these tightened up. Remember, use a torque wrench, look up the torque specs, don't be me. Okay, so that's nice and tight. So now I'm going to grab my tools off of here and set them to the side. And I'm going to lift the van back up in the air. Whoops, dropped my light on the ground. I'm going to lift this thing back up in the air so I can start getting the lower cover back on, tighten up that bottom bolt on that bracket. Then I'm going to have to take my crankshaft pulley bolt out of the crankshaft, put that little ring back on that I talked about earlier, and then put my cover back on. So let me get this raised up in the air here. I like to raise it up all the way as high as it'll go. That way it gives me, I'm 6 foot tall, so it helps a lot when it's way up here like this. Okay, so now I'm gonna grab my 14 ratcheting wrench and I'm gonna tighten up this bottom bolt on this bracket that I just tightened up those top 2 on. Get it going by hand first as far as I can get it. Grab my ratchet. Make sure I'm going the right way. Tighten this bolt down. Get her nice and snug. And then I'm going to grab my impact again. And I'm going to zip this bolt back out of here. Back out of the crankshaft. Okay, take that back out. Oh shit, I just stepped in my coolant bucket and spilled it because I wasn't paying attention. We'll deal with that later. Okay, so now I'm going to take this ring that I took off. Remember, I set it down like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it back in the exact same orientation that I had it before. Put that on there, make sure the curved part's facing out, because if you put this on backwards, like I said, it can shred that belt and cause all kinds of engine problems. So I'm just going to rinse off this coolant off the floor here real quick. Please don't come after me, OSHA. It was a giant mistake and I'm sorry. So I'm going to rinse this off. So I don't slip on the coolant and break a leg. Alright, that's good enough for now. So now what I'm going to do is grab my lower cover here, stick this back up in here, just like that. I'm going to grab my 7 bolts that I took out earlier, start putting them in by hand here. I might need my other hand to help hold this thing, so I gotta give it a funky angle here. Start these 7 bolts by hand here. Got that lower one in. Get that one started. Oops, I dropped one. That's all right, I'll get it. Get this one started. This one up in the corner started up here. See that brand new tensioner sticking out right here. Okay, I'm gonna get this one started over here in this corner. Find the one I dropped on the floor here, right there. Okay, now I'll get this one started way up here in the top. Then I'm gonna grab my electric ratchet here and my 10mm socket. Can't hold on to anything today. Okay. And then I'm gonna get my ratchet out here and just tighten down all 7 of these bolts. These don't have to be very tight, they're just holding the cover on, so don't go crazy with it. Just kind of snug them up a little bit. That one tight. That one. Go over here to this one in the corner here. My battery keeps falling out. Alright. Tighten down this one. And then I'll tighten up these last 2 down here. One there. And this one over here. Okay. And get my socket off of here. Alright. And now I'm going to grab my crankshaft pulley here, and you can see that the keyway is facing straight up, and you can see the little slot in the pulley where the keyway goes, so I'm going to slip this on there. Just kind of give it a wiggle and push. Get that on there as good as I can. Then I'm going to grab my crankshaft pulley bolt here, get it started by hand. Grab my impact, and tighten down this bolt. Okay, you want to make sure it's tight, but you don't want to go too crazy, because with that special socket that could break that bolt if you're not careful. Get that bolt tightened, and now I'm going to drop this thing back down. Oh crap. That was funny. I stepped on the hose and it started spraying everywhere, so let me shut the hose off. It's leaking. Okay, get that out of my way. So now I'm going to lower this thing back down again. Slowly but surely it's coming down. Okay, get it down here. Figure out what I did with my light here. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put these upper timing belt covers back on. Start with the rear one here. Just stick it in there. And then just kind of make sure the wire is not in the way. And then it just kind of slips in like that. And I'm going to grab and start my 5 bolts by hand here. They can give you a hard time sometimes if this isn't exactly straight. Just get them all started in their holes. Sorry, you can't really see what I'm doing here. Get this back one in here, way back here. Can't even see what I'm doing with my camera here. And then there's one more in this hole right over here. Get that one started by hand, if I can. And I'm going to do the same thing I did before. before. Grab my little ratchet, and I'm going to tighten down these 5 bolts. Okay, and then that wire I talked about earlier, I'm going to slip that wire back into its holder here. Just push her in there, make sure she's nice and flat. Then I'm going to grab the front cover here. Let me set this down, get my bolts, put the front cover on, get these bolts started by hand like the other one. Get all 5 of these bolts in there with my fingers. This one's kind of a pain in the butt to get to, so I'm going to have to set this down. See if I'm trying to make it so you can see what I'm doing, but it's not working too good here. Okay. This one's kind of difficult to reach. Okay. Get this one in here. Get that started by hand. This last one started. And then just like I did before, I'm going to take my ratchet, tighten down these 5 bolts. Okay, all the bolts are tight. Now I'm going to grab my serpentine belt tensioner here. See if I can get a good enough angle where you can see this. Apologize about not being able to see what I'm doing, but I'm just going to put this back down here where it goes. Kind of have to finagle it in there to get it in its spot, and then just get the bolt lined up with the hole down there, which I'm having a hard time seeing, but it's down there somewhere. Just get this big bolt started by hand real quick here. Then I'm going to grab this little 12 millimeter bolt here and stick that back down in the bottom down there. And get that started by hand. Get it snugged up with my fingers as best as I can. Excuse me. Okay. Can't really see what I'm doing, but just tightening this big bolt down as much as I can with my fingers till I can't turn it anymore. Okay, then I'm going to grab my 17 millimeter ratcheting wrench and finish tightening that down a little bit. There it is. Okay, get my 17 wrench on this bolt. Get this nice and tight. Like I keep saying, use a torque wrench. Grab my 12 millimeter socket on my 3/8 ratchet and tighten down this bottom bolt down here. And this one doesn't have to be ungodly tight either. Use a torque wrench. Get her nice and snug down. And then I've got this little 10 millimeter bolt here that goes into this hole, holds this wire harness cover on, and get that started by hand. Grab my 10mm socket on my battery ratchet, snug that down. And I'm going to grab my motor mount here, stick this back into place down here where it goes. And get the bolt started with my fingers. Get that top one started. Just make sure they're started by hand before you go trying to gun them in or whatever.